Okay, so welcome to the final guide for healing hard mode operations in 3.0. I'm Moralos, and today I will be playing a Mercenary healer. Of all the healers, Mercenary is probably the best for this fight because it has some distinct advantages on the top floor, although in general for the fight, any of the healers are just fine. So this fight's one of the most difficult fights to heal of all 10 fights on hard mode. Probably just about as difficult as Cortani in Ravagers. So there's several mechanics that cause a significant amount of damage in this first phase. One will be the Heave, which is a raid-wide AoE hit that goes out every 30 seconds, cast by Revan. The second is Essence Corruption, which deals a small amount of damage. It's a dot. It's placed on 2 players at a time, and it causes them to deal less damage. If not cleansed, they obviously won't be able to do as much damage, which will slow down the phase, and it will also cause some damage. It has to be cleansed away from the group. You can see that here as we cleanse the first set of them. Otherwise, it will spread to other players. So in terms of heal positioning, we try to just keep the group together and keep the group moving up behind Revan. It doesn't have to be right on Revan, but relatively close to Revan, so that you can benefit from AoE heals every time that Revan does the Heave. Whenever a player gets Essence Corruption, they should move out from the group and then get cleansed. What we do is if this one player gets 2 stacks of Essence Corruption instead of 2 players getting 1 stack each, we have it assigned so that I cleanse first and the other healer Servali cleanses that player second. If you try to cleanse at the same time, sometimes one of the 2 cleanses will be wasted and then you'll have to cleanse again. And if you fall behind on cleansing Essence Corruption, you're in a lot of trouble. So the other mechanic you have to deal with, the other 2 mechanics are the blades, which you see I failed to knock back one of the blades correctly there, as well as the tether beam, which you'll see going out throughout the phase. And when you get the tether beam, you take a large amount of damage if you don't break it by running on either side of the beam in the center. So now we are on HK phase, and this phase is quite difficult to heal if you're not prepared for the damage. So what we do to mitigate the damage is have each healer cleanse their tank, and so in this case I'm assigned to cleanse every day. And Servali, the other healer, is assigned to cleanse Selim. So we always prioritize cleansing the tank within a GCD or 2 after grenades go out. You'll need to focus heals on any tank that has 2 stacks of the Shiv debuff, because they will take extreme amounts of damage. Usually, at this point, I do not need to pop any healing adrenal unless a tank gets 3 or more stacks of Shiv by accident, but I generally do use up all my heat healing the tanks. Other than that, your responsibility is to move out of the cleave that HK does, as well as move away from the group with your own grenades since you're unable to cleanse it. You also should be interrupting one of the entropy surprise probes every time a set of droids comes up, in order to destroy that probe and continue with the phase. Now, you can have your healers interrupt different probes if you want to, but we've generally found that by having a DPS interrupt one, a tank interrupt one, and both healers interrupt the same probe, we have the best results, because healers are the only ones who can have an interrupt miss. So by having both healers interrupt the same one, we're much more likely not to have an interrupt missed. And this is not a necessary strategy, but it's quite helpful. So welcome to floor 2. This is actually the easiest floor once you get used to it, because there's no RNG on this floor, and so all of the events happen in a fixed sequence. The key is just mastering that sequence and remembering which mechanic comes next. At the beginning here, I try to put in a little bit of DPS on Revan just to make the phase go faster, and then prepare for 2 mechanics. One is the cleave on the main tank, and then the other is the knockout. There is a knockout and a pull-in that repeats every 15 seconds from this point on until the end of the fight. The key to dealing with this mechanic is just watching your position and then moving accordingly. Since we are a raid filled of all bounty hunters, we actually have hydraulics to cheese this mechanic, although as you see that we don't necessarily need hydraulics in order to deal with the mechanic, it just helps a little bit. At this point, we're about to get knocked off again, and we've dealt with the blades, so we're just going to run through around to the next position. At this point, you're mainly just healing the tanks, and the movement is pretty easy. Your position in terms of how far you stand in or out on the platform is determined whether it's going to be a pull in or a pull out next. And in terms of how far around on the platform you are, we just bring Revan from 12 to 3 to 6 to 9 to 6 to, and then back to 3, where 12 is the spot where Revan stands. So it's a pretty simple pattern. So at this point, we're just backing up, following back along to 6 o'clock. We get pulled in. We take a large amount of damage from the cleave, and Salim is taking a large amount of damage from having Trail of Agony while being hit by Heave and the blades and so forth. At this point, we're preparing to push Revan. The trick we use at this point is actually waiting to push him, so that means holding DPS in our case, until he casts Force Aberration. This allows us to put in extra DPS during the Force Aberration cast and take another 100 to 150k off of Revan's health. So you see he's at 1.33 million. If you don't do this trick, he'll probably be around 1.5 million. So at this point we have just one of the DPS climbing to the top, and when this DPS has reached the top, we'll all just step through the circle. Okay, so we're going to be moving on to floor 3, and one of the hardest things on floor 3 is that while the unstable aberrations explode, if you use a heal that turns yourself towards a friendly player, you are potentially going to get knocked off the edge, so beware of that. So now we're transitioning to floor 3, and like I said, the hardest thing is doing just enough healing to keep yourself alive while keeping the rest of the raid alive. So what I do at the beginning here is put in some DPS on Revan, and then I immediately, as soon as he starts casting Unstable Aberration, go over to the side, on the south side, to knock off the Blade of Revan where it spawns. My other healer is doing the same thing on the north side. I use hydraulics here in order to avoid the knockout, although if you do not have hydraulics, it's possible just to position correctly. Here I am largely stopping healing and just making sure I turn correctly towards the unstable aberrations as they explode, and then allowing myself to be pulled in. You have plenty of time between explosions of unstable aberrations to top back off the raid, so I throw in a couple DPS moves here just to help the DPS on the machine core because it's very tight. Then I prepare for the unstable aberration explosions again. Now, in this case, we have our raid leader calling out clock positions for which way to turn. This means I don't really have to look myself for which way to turn, but if you do not have someone calling this out, then you will need to be panning your camera. I generally find, though, that it's somewhat difficult to pan your camera around while clicking on the raid frame. So throughout this phase, you need to just keep making sure that you do not get knocked off the platform when there's a knockout, and that you either use hydraulics or run out for the pull-in. Every time there's unstable aberrations, you want to try to face towards them. Now there, I made a mistake. I didn't turn towards the correct one, and I was killed, but in this case, they saved the battle res for if a DPS or heal died, so I got battle rest. One of the most important things during the unstable aberration explosions is that you can also have a heave go off, and this happens generally during the second, third, and fourth sets of purples exploding. So every time this happens, you need to make sure you do some healing, even if you're dealing with the purple explosions. One of my favorite things to do is try to align myself with two purples, and then either use healing scan or use progressive scan on a merc healer, and you could do something similar on both of the other healers. Remember, your goal as a healer in this phase is to put in a little bit of DPS on the machine core while keeping yourself alive and doing just enough healing in order to keep the rest of the raid alive. So every time unstable aberrations explode, I'm trying to prioritize facing them while doing just maybe 2 heals during the explosions, just to keep people from dying. Now, as we get up to high amounts of stacks, I've actually died, so I'm not at risk of dying here. But as you go over 60 stacks, the heave will kill you, potentially, if you don't use it defensive. So you see everyone use reactive shield here. And then we top them back off for the last set of purple explosions. So from here, it's fairly simple to end the fight. We just have to survive the purples, and then put in the final bit of DPS on the machine core. You're really racing against having too high of stacks to survive a heave, which we're just running to here. There's also an enrage timer of 11 minutes, but it's honestly not as much of a concern. If you run into that enrage timer, you probably don't have the DPS to kill the machine core before the last heave anyway. Thanks for watching.